I've got a great tale for you today. It's called The Luck Child, and it was written by Minghella. Some kids from Sanderling are going to know this story. They will have heard it, and I'm sure you'll love it again, right? And my kids have heard it a few times. They really like it. They ask for it again and again. So, The Luck Child. Oh, I might say hello to Tayan. Hi, Tayan. And I might say hello to, I will say hello to Gaia and Amara again. And I'll say hello to Drew. Drew, I want to paint with you. And I want to say hello to Robin and Zoe. And I want to say hello to my friends in Australia, Rachel and her three. I hope you're listening and enjoying. Hi Ethan, my nephew, and hi Ethan and Alina, and anybody else I've forgotten. Everyone from Sanderling, hello. The Luck Child. Not so long ago, here in the deep north, where it can be so cold, just very cold is considered quite warm, two dark hearts ruled the land. One beat cold in a cruel king, and the other in a terrible beast, a griffin. And it happened in a week with 2 Fridays that the cruel king heard of a prophecy. A child had been born, reported his spies. A luck child, poor as penance, rich as snow, the 7th son of a 7th son. Wise men prophesied this child would one day be king and claim all of the riches in the realm. Superstition, majesty, folklore, advised his evil chancellor. Old wives' tales. How could a peasant's child, not worth a spit, how could a brat become king? But the cruel king choked on the news, could not swallow it, felt it sharpen and pierce his heart. So he vowed a cold vow, the boy would not live to see the snow melt and the summer come. And before dawn, he set out with his chancellor to find this luck child and do him in. Don't be too scared, you know, because I would never take you on a journey that was going to be too bad. You know that, right? Okay. Now the boy they sought was indeed a humble child. Even as they rode, king and chancellor, through the bleak hills and barren lands of the realm, even as they planned their wicked wiles, a tiny infant was at his mother's breast, rags to swaddle him, huddled for warmth, poor as penance, rich as snow. Gifts came for him, scraps of food, thin shawls, a blanket, for folks in these parts knew of the blessing of a 7th son to a 7th son and honoured it. And joy warmed the simple hut where his mother lay and his father watched and his brothers slept. The luck child's sweet smile echoed in the room from mother to father, from brother to brother, and they lacked nothing except the full belly and the wherewithal to fill it. While baby fed and family slept, the father went from boy to boy, collecting strips of clothing, ripping his own coat to make do for his new son, and he thought the while on the long winter and how he might feed them all. May the days bless us, he prayed silently, and the night protect us, and the Lord watch over us. Amen, whispered his wife. A harsh knocking broke the silence. The father went to the door and opened it to the weather. Standing there he saw 2 men, hooded against the wind, fur framing their faces. We come in search of the luck child, said one of them sternly, peering in at the cradle. Is this him? The father said it was indeed so, that in those parts they counted such a child as lucky, although they had nothing in the way of a fortune for him. One of the men dipped into his cloak and produced a purse, and from it he took a thick gold piece, and he held it up for them to see. The last flickers of the fire caught the gold, and it sparkled. Husband and wife had never seen gold, and were startled by it. Neither spoke. The man shook his purse, which jingled. My master here, a good man, brings 7 pieces like this, he declared, the gold jingling in evidence. He seeks a child to patron and to care for. At this, the second man stepped forwards, face in shadows, and nodded. As if he were my own son, he said quietly. The first stranger explained their mission. They would swap the 7 gold pieces for the luck child. He and his master stood impatient, while husband looked to his wife, and then both looked sadly to the floor. It's a bargain, I take it? Asked the first man. Yes or no? Cajoled his master. Finally, the mother spoke in a small voice. He's my little boy, she said, not looking at the strangers and their bag of gold, but pleadingly at her husband. The first man dismissed this with a wave of his hand. You have 6 others, mother, he said, curtly, and now they'll be plump as pigs. The mother wept. The children woke. Her baby began to cry. He's my little lover, she whispered as she held the tiny bundle to her. The first man sighed. Well, of course, he said in a sour voice, you must have more gold to comfort yourself, and he dug into his pockets for a second purse. 'Tis not more gold my missus wants, said her husband, standing by her and placing a protective hand on her shoulder. You can't put gold to your breast. You can't hear its heartbeat. At this, the strangers dropped their guise of generosity. The evil chancellor, for it was he, addressed the father in his real voice, a poisonous hiss. Please yourselves, he hissed. You've had your chance. And so saying, he went to his master, the cruel king. I'll send the men in the morrow, said the king, and turn the snow bloody. And the father heard these terrible words and had fear of his family, who one by one had woken and clung to him and to each other, threatened by the 2 hooded strangers. He looked at his wife hugging the precious baby. They could say nothing, but their hearts spoke. What could they do but sacrifice the one for the sake of the others? What could they hope but that these tall men with their rich furs and their bags of gold would take the child and care for him, hoarding his luck? The father bent down to his wife and gently unclasped her hands from the baby, kissed his tiny forehead, and gave him to the chancellor. We'll hand over our little boy to your safekeeping, he said sadly, and the chancellor snatched the baby away, tossed the purse into the empty cradle, and headed for the door. Look after him, eh? Cried the father, because he's a little precious, you see, the 7th son of a 7th son. His voice cracked with emotion. He's a luck child. The 2 men, hurrying out, left no words of comfort behind them. The door flung open in their wake chilled the room. And that was that. Husband looked at wife, who looked at children. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No one spoke for a long time. In the silence the cradle swung, jingling the gold pieces. Had it been filled to the brim with gold, it could not have comforted them. Outside, the 2 men rode on through the bitter cold, while the snow pinched and punched and slapped at their faces. On they went, their grim hearts set, until they came at length to where black cliffs traced the edge of the kingdom, a dreadful drop from land to sea. They left their horses, and they hastened to the brink, the chancellor carrying the luck child in his arms, and looking down to watch the waves crash against the rocks below. The chancellor turned to the king, shouting to be heard, The fall will finish him, or the icy waves. Oblivious to this terrible scheme, the luck child smiled a charming smile that touched even the king's hard heart. That's a nice smile, he said in a troubled voice. I'd smile too, returned the chancellor, reminding him of the prophecy. Given your kingdom, given your gold, given all that is rightfully yours. Would you? Said the king sharply. The chancellor caught his suspicion and was at pains to explain. I wouldn't, sire, he insisted, scrape and grovel. I mean, he would. I speak of him. The king nodded, eyes narrowing. I can't look, he said, pointing to the drop. How far down is it? The Chancellor bent over the edge to estimate, and as he did so, the king placed a boot on his back and kicked him over the brink, sending him flying into space, dropping like a stone, the baby with him, hurtling into the black jaws, the infant's shawl unwinding as it fell, a white flag unfurling in the darkness. That's right, cried the king. You go too, sir. No one will share my crown. And he shook his fist at the air in triumph, his own roar merging with the Chancellor's as he crashed to the ground, the rocks and the waves rushing up to meet him. And the cruel king turned and went back to his horse, his heart pounding at the deed, the baby done for, the prophecy denied. But had the king looked, had the king watched, the sneer would have left his lips. For oh yes, the baby fell. Oh yes, he plummeted down, dropping into the dark, the sea roaring below, the black rocks beckoning. Oh yes, he plunged downwards. But remember, this was a luck child. The shawl caught on a jutting rock and wound round, pulling the baby up short before dropping him gently down onto the shore, sand, soft, safe. The evil Chancellor fared less well. The sea had him. As for the cold king, the days went by, and from time to time he thought of the luck child, and he felt a little bad, a tiny bit bad, a fleeting bit bad. But soon he quite forgot what he'd done out of fear of a prophecy. Besides, it wasn't long before he had a baby of his own. He had a little girl. She sought out the one soft part of his heart, and she touched it. How he loved his little darling. And the years passed, 10, 12, 15, 16. The daughter turned out a lovely, a princess talked of, longed for. Oh, and the offers, hundreds. But the king was vexed. He didn't want her married. He wasn't going to lose her in a hurry, or his money, or his jewels, or his castles, or his crowns, or the things he wouldn't even mention in case anyone stole them. Hands off, is what the king thought. Hands off all my lovelies. And greed grew in him like a canker until he could enjoy nothing, until he would not count his gold for fear of rubbing it away with his fingers. Instead, he travelled his kingdom, inspecting his harvests, collecting taxes, worrying each farthing into the royal coffers, and always the king wanted more. So it was that one day he came to a mill, busy with the reckoning of the crop. All morning the king had come, all morning the men had come, trundling in carts loaded with their year's efforts, knowing that for every sack they might keep, the king would take 2. Inside, the miller ground the grain while his son wrote the figures in a ledger. And though much was given away, enough was kept, for the sun and the rain had come that year in plenty, and the harvest was good. So spirits were high, and the miller's wife went between the men with a cup of cider and a heel of bread, and who didn't sing, clapped, and who didn't clap, laughed, and all was merry. Then trumpets sounded as the king approached, and the mill fell silent. In he swept, glaring at the gathered sacks, noting the big pile which was his, and begrudging the small piles which were not. All bowed and cowered at his entrance, save for the miller's son, a handsome youth with golden hair, who remained at his seat as the king strode towards him. "I am in your region inspecting harvests," announced the king. "How goes it?" The miller's son smiled. "Fair, sir," he said pleasantly, and handed over the ledger. The king checked each entry with a sour eye, his finger running down the list. "Am I cheated?" he demanded suspiciously. "I will not be cheated." The boy shook his head. "No, sire. he told the king, and then continued in a bold voice, for he was a brave fellow. I have counted each tithe and entered it. Your people sweat for each ear of wheat, each cob of corn. The miller chimed in anxiously, and your majesty also needs his tithes, of course. Of course, agreed the wife, their eyes darting to the king to see if this appeased him. The king glowered at them. That's right, he said threateningly, but the miller's son was undaunted. That's right, he echoed, smiling the while. Otherwise we'd all be lords and no king, and then what? All around the mill the peasants, still kneeling, shrank back at this daring and waited for the king's response. The king walked over to the miller. A shadow crept across his brain, nagging. How come the boy is fair? He asked suspiciously, when you two are dark. The miller coughed nervously, glancing at his wife. Before he had time to reply, his son answered for him. I'm a foundling, sire, he said easily. The shadow over the king deepened. He stared at the boy, his eyes fixed on the smile, wondering why he felt like he'd seen that smile 1,000 times before, in his dreams, in his waking thoughts. Found where? He demanded. Found when? The miller placed a protective arm around his son. By the Black Cliffs, he mumbled, his voice faltering. 17 years since. Washed up without a scrap on his little body. The king's heart began to race. You're a lucky one then, he said. Father and mother nodded, relieved. That's what we call him, said the miller enthusiastically. Lucky. Now the king knew the worst, knew where the shadow had come from, knew why the smile had haunted him. Bile curdled his mouth and he gasped, hardly able to catch his breath for his thumping heart. For he knew the boy must be the one born to claim his throne, the luck child. Kill him, thumped his heart. Kill him, kill him, kill him. He walked over to Lucky, biting his lip. A boy like you would do well at court, he said. Lucky's face fell. I'm needed here, sire. Then you'll be missed, snorted the king, turning to the parents. I'll take the boy. And with that, and no brooking, no disagreement, he took pen and paper and began to write. Take this to the queen, he instructed Lucky. It's a royal warrant. She'll welcome you into our care. And sealing the paper, he handed it to Lucky and left, as if he had left once before, stealing a child from its parents. His page stepped forward. Hurrah for the king, he cried, a sharp look requiring agreement. Hurrah for the king, the peasants chorused. Hurrah for the king. So that night, the luck child, after 17 years of peace and happiness, set off alone on his royal errand, oblivious to his own true identity, oblivious to the king's foul designs, oblivious to all save sorrow in his heart, the sad farewells to his mother and father, the past behind him, the adventure ahead. He clutched the royal warrant and pushed on. But there was many a mile between mill and palace, many a forest, and Lucky had no horse or map. As the night settled on his head like a huge cloth, he was very soon lost. He went round in circles, hungry and tired, missing the harvest dance and the cider and the pretty village girls. Head fuddled, he plunged once more into the trees. But a man on foot could not fathom this place. Folk went in, but few came out. And foul things lived there. Owls hooted, branches rustled, the wind moaned, things slid and slithered underfoot. Lucky shivered, pressing on, full of courage, until suddenly, without warning, the ground gave way beneath him, and before he knew it, he was falling for the second time in his short life, down, down, down and down. Lucky was in a hole which sucked him up, pulling him into his stomach. He dropped for what seemed like minutes and then crashed, smashed and dashed on the bottom. Dazed and bewildered, Lucky opened his eyes to a strange sight. He was in a cave, an inch from a bubbling cauldron, and all around him, as he peered into the dim light, he saw treasures and trophies piled on the ground. A voice from nowhere made him jump in surprise. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear," it said. Lucky turned, searching for the speaker, but saw nothing. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear," the voice repeated, and Lucky looked down and saw the smallest man he had ever set eyes on. A tiny, bearded, shifty chap with darting eyes and a little skipping shuffle. "Oh dear," he continued regretfully. "You've fallen in among thieves. This is a robber's cave, a terrible place." Lucky explained he was on a royal business and showed the little man his letter from the king. The little man shook his head and looked anxiously about him. "I see," he muttered. "Oh dear, are you hungry?" Lucky looked about him, searching for an exit, but there didn't seem to be one, save the endless hole from whence he had come. He turned to the little man, too late to catch him. Add a dash of white powder to the bowl of steaming stew he had dished out. "It's goulash," he announced the little man, handing him the bowl, and producing an old bent spoon which he huffed and polished on his filthy apron. It smelled delicious, piping hot. "Thanks," said Lucky, accepting it with relish. "I'm supposed to be Lucky. That's my name, Lucky. But I don't seem very—" And at that was about as far as he got, for a single spoonful of the little man's goulash sent him reeling to the floor in a stupor, spoon and bowl scattering with a clatter. "That's it," the little man shrieked, hovering over Lucky's drugged body. "I'm the cook, also the poisoner, also the nastiest." And with that, he set about searching the boy for booty. But he was disappointed. Lucky had nothing, not a sausage, only his royal warrant poking from his pocket. With a tut and a cluck and an irritated hiss, the little man snatched up the letter and broke the seal with his knife. "A letter from the king, eh?" he muttered. "Well, this will never reach the palace. Oh, no, your luck's run out. Oh, dear me, yes." So muttering, he sat on a rock and began to read. The little man could not believe his eyes. "Terrible! What a terrible letter! This is terrible," he announced. And this is what the letter said. "Wife," it began, "when you read this letter, order the bearer of it, a youth named Lucky, to be chopped into 1,000 pieces. Do this without delay. King." The little man was outraged. "This is disgusting," he declared, and regarded Lucky with pity. "Poor fellow," he said, all heart and sympathy. "We'll soon see about this." Now, he was also a forger, this little man. Full of fair play, he sat down to write a new letter. Oh, yes, he sat with his wax and his quill and a ready will and practised the king's sly script until even the cold monarch himself could have seen no difference. And then he began to write. So it was the next morning the luck child woke, refreshed and restored, and remarkably, with the palace straight in front of him. Very odd, he thought, but off he set, without more ado, blessing his luck and brandishing his letter with the royal seal. He didn't see the little man watching from the woods, a benign smile on his little lips, a gleeful twinkle in his little eyes. No, my dearies, Lucky blessed his luck and hurried on, hole, cave and goulash fading from his mind as he viewed the finery before him. "I have a letter from His Majesty," he cried at the drawbridge. "A letter from His Majesty," at the entrance to the court. In he went to find the Queen sitting stitching at the open window, and in a chair beside her, weaving at a loom, with eyes like licorice, smile like heaven, hair like silk, and skin like satin, was the princess, her daughter. And a thing happened straight off. Lucky looked at the princess looked at Lucky, and that was it. Love. Oh, yes. As the perplexed queen greeted this unlikely youth, and opened her husband's letter, Lucky quite forgot where he was, or who he was, or why he was there, and he dropped into the deep for a third time, dropped into the licorice lakes. The Queen, meanwhile, read and reread the letter in her hand, her glasses falling from her nose. "Gracious!" she cried. "Well, gracious me!" A week later, the King was on his journey home. A boo to him and a hiss. He gloated. He gloated on the gold, on the riches squeezed from the poor, each tiny speck of something, a brooch, an earring, a wedding ring, gifts from husbands to wives, mothers to daughters, plucked from the ears and fingers of his people, dropped into sacks to bloat his coffers. But it was not the wealth he was dragging home which drew the sneer across his evil face. No, it was relish. He was savouring his cruel deed, savouring the luck-child in bits. He rode along contemplating the boy in 1,000 bits. How many pieces to a hand, he wondered, or to an ear? A mile from the palace he heard bells. A party of bells. A delirium of bells. He could not hear for bells. He signalled for his men to investigate, but they could not hear him for all the bells. And at the edge of the palace, hundreds of people were cheering, or so he guessed. He could not hear the cheers for bells ringing, but their happiness was clear in the sea of flags waving and dancing. And then, looking up to the battlements, the King saw something, and he couldn't believe it. For framed on the royal balcony, waving down to the crowd, the Queen smiling behind them, stood the Princess and Lucky, both in white and lace, hand in hand, strewn with confetti. A noise came out of the King's mouth, a howl, a whine of rage, rage, rage. His heart thumped, his veins popped out of his neck, his face went puce, then purple, then thunderously dark. Oh, he howled. Oh, his daughter, his future, his precious treasure, standing there embracing the luck-child for all to see. How, he howled, but no one listened. How, he demanded of the King as he burst in, of the Queen as he burst into the court. His wife hurried towards him, equally bewildered. "You ordered it," she cried, "on pain of death." The King thought his heart was shattered, would shatter. "I ordered him to be chopped into 1,000 pieces." He read the letter the Queen thrust at him, and there in his own hand the luck-child must marry the Princess, marriage on pain of death. Ordered in his handwriting. "Do this without delay, King." The King's head sagged. The letter slipped from his grasp and floated to the floor. His head filled up with the words of the prophecy, repeating over and over like a spell. The luck-child will one day become king. The luck-child will one day become king. He couldn't shut the words out of his mind. The luck-child will one day become king. The Princess saw her father and rushed in from the balcony. "Father," she cried, leaping into his arms, "we're so happy!" And following on, looking every inch the prince, came her husband, the luck-child. "Majesty," he began humbly, kneeling in front of the King, "forgive me. I had thought you a cruel tyrant, a blight on the poor, but now you make this humble peasant your son and heir and the happiest husband there ever was." The cold King couldn't look at him. He turned away, his brain grasping and clutching. And then it came to him. The solution. The only solution. A thin smile creased his mouth and his eyes glinted. "And the golden feather?" he asked innocently. Lucky was confused. "I beg your pardon?" "The golden feather from the griffin," he said impatiently. "Do you not have it?" The Princess looked at her and her mother in horror. "No, sire," said Lucky. "Then you must fetch it," said the King told him, his smile thickening into a sneer. "Was it not understood my daughter could not marry without it?" "But that's impossible," cried the princess, clinging to her husband. "The griffin is a monster. It eats people. It's terrible." "She's right," said the queen sadly. "Oh, yes, she's right," thought the king. "I have him now. Now I have him." "Yes," he agreed aloud, "it won't be easy. But then, not every man is fit to marry my daughter. That is the condition, the griffin's golden feather." "Very well," said Lucky, with a deep breath. And though the princess wept, and though the queen sorrowed, though the king smirked, he strode boldly to the door. "Don't worry," he told them, gathering up his courage. "I'll come back." But the princess wept and wept. "No one has ever come back." "We'll see," said her husband defiantly, and without more ado he set off in search of the golden feather from the tail of the griffin. Off he marched. The luck child, his chin a determined jut. "To the griffin," he told himself, "to the griffin." It became a direction when he had none, a distance when he knew none. "What do you seek?" folk asked him. "The griffin." "How far do you travel?" "To the griffin." And he paid no heed to the warnings, the weeping at his folly. No, he marched on. With each month his resolve strengthened. With each mile the land got poorer. Green gave way to dust. On, no lush, no life, the black deserts of the griffin. On and on. He trudged until one day he came to a lake in which no fish swam, and in the middle of the lake was an island, and in the middle of the island was a shattered layer of the griffin. Lucky looked and was dazzled, for the island was pitted with jewels, the shore dusted with gold. It sparkled, cold as flint, on the black mirrors of the water, until a fine mist rose around it and crept to the far bank where Lucky stood, wondering how he might get across. Soon he could see nothing at all, the mist enveloping him. A curlew called, and then Lucky heard a bell, a handbell chiming sorrowfully across the water, sounding nearer and nearer, bringing with it the dim shape of a boat, a small craft steered by a tall, stooping figure. "Hey, ferryman," called Lucky, "will you take me across?" The boat slid into the shore, and there before him was the oldest man Lucky had ever seen. His white hair and white beard engulfed him, leaving only the eyes dark and haunted and the mouth pale and wan. "I go across, back and forth, ceaselessly, with you or without you," said the ferryman in a voice of funerals. Lucky barely had time to step onto the boat before he did, indeed, push away from the bank and set off slowly into the mist. "I seek the griffin," Lucky told him, holding on to the sides of the narrow craft, the ferryman poling sadly through the waveless water. The ferryman simply nodded and said nothing. Lucky peered into the mist, the world silent save for the curlew calling and the steady rise and fall of the oar. The island loomed before them, the jewels shimmering. "Such jewels," sighed Lucky, "such riches." "No one brings them back," replied the ferryman, his own voice shrouded in gloom, his head bowed wearily. "I shall," announced the boy, determined. "I shall come back." The ferryman shook his white head, the eyes hollow. "Ah," he murmured, "if you do, perhaps you'll discover why I must continue this weary way back and forth without ending, for I am tired and sick to my soul." And so saying, the ferry reached the opposite bank, and Lucky leapt off, all youth and courage. "I'll remember," he promised, and turned to wave, but already the craft had set off again, sliding into the mist, the ferryman's bowed head slowly vanishing. For each one who came the same tale, the griffin, please, for love, for justice, for fame, for fortune, but always in the end, the griffin's supper. The ferryman turned and pushed down his oar away from the bank, not wanting to hear the boy's cries, the splintering bones and the sucking of the juices. Lucky walked into the griffin's ruined domain. The great beast had ripped open the roof, smashing through the stone and timbers, turning what had once been a palace into a vast, filthy nest, lined with muck and bones and things spat out. A dark, dank, damp stench overwhelmed Lucky as he wandered the hall, the stone flagstones bare save for a table large enough to seat 100 men, but with only a single massive chair set against it. Lucky shivered as the cold air whistled through the rafters, and he looked up at the black night and the moon above his head. Evil hung over him like foul breath, and for the first time in his brave life he knew what fear was. A scampering noise startled him, and he jumped round, dagger at the ready. Oh dear, said a familiar voice. Lucky couldn't believe it. Looking up at him was the ragtag and darting-eyed little man. Lucky was relieved and delighted, and said so at once, embracing the little man and wondering what on earth he was doing there. And the little man told him that the griffin had smashed open the cave and carried him away. His cooking had saved him, he explained, and now he was a servant for the terrible monster. Then Lucky said he'd come for the golden feather, and the little man's face fell. Impossible, he told Lucky, impossible. But Lucky had come too far to hear these words again. He made a solemn promise to his wife. By hook or by crook, fair means or foul, he had to have the feather. The little man scratched his little ragged head and sent clouds of lice buzzing angrily around him. Hide under the table, he told the boy, and I'll do what I can. Lucky hugged him with glee and made for the table, crouched under it, and then popped his head out. I must also discover how the poor ferryman can cease his ceaseless crossing. Before the little man could reply, a huge shadow threw the hall into darkness, and high above them they heard a dreadful beating of wings. Quick, quick, urged the little man, and Lucky dived back under the table. As the furious beating grew louder, the little man scampered to the kitchen where an enormous pot of goulash simmered, and he added the entire contents of his sleeping herbs, enough to send an army to sleep, and then with a terrifying thump on the floor of the hall, causing dust and bones to jump and shudder, the griffin arrived. The beast which filled the banquet hall struck fear in folks' hearts and haunted their dreams. Misbehaving children were threatened with his name. The sight of him flying through the clouds sent strong men screaming for safety. The griffin was immense. His massive head, half lion, half dragon, sat on the body of a giant golden eagle. His claws could rip a tree from its roots. His wings could slap down a house. He was neither good nor bad, not knowing the meaning of the word. He was simply hungry, always hungry. And when he was hungry, he was hangry. His rage was horrible. Lucky could only see the griffin's talons. They had landed by him, crushing an abandoned skull into dust. He shrank into shadows of the table and waited, and the griffin threw back its head, his huge nostrils heaving like bellows. My sniff, snuff, snuff, man whiff, he complained, snorting. The little man appeared, dragging the steaming pots of goulash. Of course you can smell a man, he cried cheerily. That's me. The griffin shook his head, his wings restless. No, he said dangerously. Snuffle, snort, other sort. Lucky tried to make himself invisible while the little man fussed and soothed the griffin, clucking and cooing and stirring the pot. At the sight of the food, the griffin's beak unclamped and a cavern of a mouth appeared. A mouth big enough to eat a house. I could eat a house, said the griffin. And with that he dipped his beak into the goulash, and within seconds the cauldron was licked clean, goulash and sleeping herbs sucked into the bottomless stomach. The little man watched carefully, but the potion seemed to have no effect on the monster. He belched a gust of goulash smothering his cook, and then demanded a scratch, as was his custom. "Scritch, itch, scratch, scratch," he demanded, and the little man clambered up onto his back to oblige. The griffin loved to be scratched. He twisted and turned and arced and arched and purred, while the little man ran his nails through the feathers. "Yum, he sighed deliriously. The little man preened away, working his way upwards towards the single golden feather on his back, and he tugged at it. "Ow!" roared the griffin, and reared up, his wings suddenly flapping with a horrible violence. The little man clung on for dear life. "I know!" he cried desperately. "Clumsy! I'm clumsy! I scratched too hard!" "Youch!" sulked the griffin. But he would not let the little man stop. "No," he ordered. "Scritchy, scratchy, itch, scritch, scratch." And so he did, obediently working at the feathers until he felt the monster relax. And once again he took the golden feather in his hand and he pulled on it. "Yow!" cried the griffin, and before he could avoid it, the little man found his face sandwiched between the griffin's beak, a gulp away from joining the goulash. I'm sorry," his head as fragile as an egg. Oh dear. "Might not like things being pulled," said the griffin. The little man tried to nod his head, but couldn't. "No, that's right," he agreed. "You're a sensitive monster." The griffin was briefly pacified. "Yes," he said, and then he thought on it. "Not a monster," he corrected. "Beastie," tried the little man. The griffin shook his beak in disgust, opening his wings before crushing the little man against the table with a single claw. In the commotion, the little man managed to grasp and hang on to the golden feather, so that as the griffin reared up, it came away in his hand. He dropped it as he lay prostrate on the table, the griffin's claw pinning him casually, talons 3 inches into the wood. In a flash, Lucky shot out an arm, gathered up the feather, and retreated back under the table. "Me bird," insisted the griffin, oblivious to all this. "My misunderstood bird, my not beastie, my misunderstood bird, my not beastie." The little man could hardly breathe. "Of course you are," he wheezed. "A bird, a very nice bird. I should go back to where I came from, to that dark, horrid cave. Serves me right." "No!" roared the griffin, prodding him. The little man gasped for air, the claw all but smothering him. "Don't try to stop me. I'll tell that old ferryman to row me across. Yes, he's outside now, I expect, waiting for a passenger," he gasped. "I'll go. Poor fellow, why is he always there? Why can't he leave?" The griffin threw back his head dismissively. "It's Kirsty Wurst, and stays the same. Lest someone takes a pole, then someone cursed him the same way. So on, he clucked. Simple." Under the table, Lucky, clutching the golden feather, listening hard to this, but understood nothing. "So, if someone took the pole from him," asked the little man, more familiar with the griffin's curious expressions, "they'd have to row and he'd be free. So simple. I should go and tell the poor fellow. I should take over. Really, I should go now and I should take over." As he said this, wriggling to escape, the griffin's suffocating claw, the misunderstood bird relaxed his grip, while a massive yawn overcame him. "No," he yawned, "my like goulash and scritchy scratch. Might not like you being yink yank feather." His claws slipped away from the table, and his wings stretched in tiredness. "Go to sleep now," said the little man, scampering free. "Busy day ahead, eating people and wreaking havoc." The griffin laughed and yawned all at once, and the sleeping draught muddled his thoughts. "Yes, now then," he said wearily. The little man stroked the griffin's beak as it slumped onto the table, eyelids drooping. "That's it," he said, "snoozy woozy." And in a second, the lids dropped shut and the griffin was asleep, his head rolling over and crushing the little man again, his nostrils puffing in and out peacefully. At the first sound of the griffin's steady snore, Lucky crept out from under the table, brandishing the golden feather and beaming with delight. The little man whispered to him to be very, very quiet, and then, as Lucky stole forward to help disentangle him from the snoozing griffin, he shook his little head, patted the griffin affectionately and told Lucky to go. "Godspeed, take care, stay lucky." And so he did, leaving the huge griffin and the little man unlikely companions in the fading evening. Oh yes, my dearies, off the luck child scurried, clutching the golden feather, scooping up jewels, scooping up gold. Straight home he wanted to go, straight home to happiness. He waited impatiently at the bank for the sorrowful bell of the ferryman. As he poled slowly forward through the mist, the old man could hardly credit what he saw, but there he was, the smiling youth, leaping onto the boat as it turned and headed to the opposite shore. "I dare not think it possible you have an answer," he asked, his white head shaking. "But then you did come back, and no one has ever come back." "Well, I have come back," said Lucky triumphantly, "and I do have the answer," and this is what he told him. "The next passenger you have, hand him your oar, then your luck will be his, and his freedom yours." The ferryman's eyes misted over. "By handing him the oar?" Lucky nodded, beaming. "That's it," he confirmed. "Simple." The old ferryman was moved to tears. "So simple," he sobbed, remembering 1,000 crossings, 1,000 crossings, an age of crossings, so simple, he said. And the tears ran from him, and for the first time in years, centuries, hope fired the ferryman, because for all the tears, a smile was forming in his mind, a tiny smile growing and getting ready to be born. The king was in his counting house, smelling his money, when a trumpet sounded a fanfare. A great cheer went up on the ramparts and the battlements, and the king was paralysed. The cheering grew louder, the bells started up again, and he forced himself to the window, and he knew what he'd see below. His page burst into the room. "He's come back!" he cried. The cold hit king's heart thumped and thumped. In rushed the queen, her face alight. "He's come back!" His head throbbed. In came the princess, and before she could speak, her husband, the luck child, appeared, brandishing his trophy. "I've come back," he cried, "and I've got the golden feather." He had done as bidden, and the king could do nothing but agree and give his blessing. "You have my blessing," he said, though it cost him dear in his bitter heart. Then Lucky, his smile torturing the king, pulled open a chest loaded with treasure from the Griffin's Island. The king whimpered, his eyes popping, while the boy, his arm embracing his darling wife, explained his adventure. "I took a ferry across a lake to where the griffin lives. On the other shore gold lies where pebbles should, emeralds where sand, and where the sea breaks, diamonds fall." The treasures burned into the king's eyes, his stare glittering with greed, the want welling in him until he was giddy, until he could see nothing but the jewels. "Lucky," he mumbled. "Lucky," swallowing, swaying, skin turning hot and cold. So lucky. But even as he spoke, the poison swilling his eyes, souring his mouth, the king vowed to go himself to the Black Lake. "Greed will be my guide," he told himself, "gold my map." And that very night he slipped away alone, leaving his daughter and the luck child to their joy, and set off in search of the magic shore across the lake. And at length he found the lake, and he took a ride with an old white-haired ferryman, who seemed to row ceaselessly back and forth, tolling a sad bell, while the curlew called in the mist. And he wanted the boat to go faster, 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 and the ferryman offered him the fatal oar, telling him there was indeed a way to go faster. So if you come one day to a black lake where the curlew calls and there is an island in the mist and a ferry goes back and forth, rowed by an old sad man, turn around. Griffins live there. You may never get off the boat, for the ferryman was once a wicked king who ignored a prophecy, whose heart was cruel, and nature, my dears, is a wise woman who pays us back tit for tat. Goodbye.